The FAA has just released its final rule on remote ID, so what I want to do in this short video is give you an overview of what that rule is and how that will apply to you. Now, as of this recording, remote ID has not taken effect yet. Remote ID will not be effective for pilots until 2023, and it will be effective for manufacturers in 2022. In 2019, the FAA issued an initial notice of proposed rulemaking for remote ID, and they issued the final rule in late 2020. Now, there's a lot of big changes between the initial proposal and what the FAA finally ended up with. Some of the big changes are these that you see on your screen. First of all, there's no internet connection required, which was one of the things they proposed in their initial rule. There will be no subscriber fees. There will be no changes to aircraft registration for hobbyist pilots. And there's no deadline on establishing FAA flying sites under the new rule. So there's a lot of really good changes that all came as a result of the public comments. The FAA received 53,000 public comments on the initial remote ID rule, and they did actually listen to those comments, and as a result, the final rule is a much better rule for pilots than the initial proposal was. So what I want to do is talk about what is in that final rule, and again, keep in mind this will not be effective for pilots until 2023, but this is what is coming. So remote ID was mandated by Congress in response to law enforcement agencies' requests that all drones have some sort of way of identifying where they are and who is flying them. Law enforcement wants to be able to track these drones, and so this is what the FAA came up with. Each drone, or most drones under this new rule, are going to have to transmit the following information. Now, the biggest concern that people have are this unique serial number. This is going to be sort of like a digital license plate. So all of this data that you see on the screen is going to be public information broadcast either over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and anyone with a smartphone will be able to receive this signal and see where your drone is. But they won't be able to see who you are. That serial number is an anonymous number. The FAA will be able to correlate that serial number with who you are, and law enforcement agencies will be able to look up who you are based on that serial number. But the general public won't be able to track you personally to a specific serial number. So you will remain anonymous except to law enforcement agencies. Now, the FAA provided 3 main ways to comply with remote ID, and they are what you see here, either through a standard remote ID, a broadcast module, or something called a FRIA. Now, I'm going to talk about all 3 of these different choices. So the first method is through standard remote ID. Starting in 2022, manufacturers will be required to install remote ID on every single new drone that gets manufactured. This remote ID will broadcast over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth the drone's position, the pilot's position, the serial number of the drone that we just talked about, and also the emergency status of the aircraft. So again, anyone with a smartphone within radio range of this signal will be able to see where the drone is and where you are. That's standard remote ID. The second way of complying with remote ID is through something called a broadcast module. A broadcast module is a little postage stamp sized chip that transmits a radio signal that you can throw in your airplanes or older drones that were manufactured prior to this requirement coming out. So for model airplane enthusiasts who have a basement full of model aircraft, this is the solution that they will use. These broadcast modules will cost between about $20 and $50, and you'll be able to retrofit any old aircraft that don't have the standard ID with one of these broadcast modules. Now there's a big difference between standard ID and the broadcast module. Standard ID is going to transmit the current location of the pilot at all times, whereas the broadcast module will only transmit the takeoff position of the aircraft. So in theory, you could take off the aircraft, and then as the aircraft is flying, you could walk and move, and someone receiving that signal, they would be able to see where you started the flight from, but they won't be able to see where you are now, if you walk and move to a different location as the aircraft is flying. The third way that the FAA allows compliance with the new remote ID rule is through a FRIA, an FAA-recognized identification area. So there are multiple model aircraft clubs throughout the country. These are usually AMA clubs under the Academy of Model Aeronautics, and they have local flying fields, and hobbyists will fly their airplanes at these flying fields. Now, these local model airplane clubs can apply to the FAA for an established flying site. And once those get approved, then pilots flying at those club locations will not have to have any remote ID at all. So if you are a hobbyist who mostly flies at an airplane club field, you literally will not have to do anything. If you just keep flying at that field, you'll be okay. You don't have to install any new equipment. Another nice thing that the FAA provides is that educational institutions, universities, and K-12 schools can apply for an FAA-recognized identification area so that their students can fly in drone programs at the schools, and they won't need any remote ID on their aircraft either, as long as they are on school grounds. Okay, so I want to get in a little bit more depth on how these things work. So one thing to note is that the remote ID rule will only apply to drones that need to be registered. Now remember, drones that are less than 0.55 pounds do not require a registration. And so these drones less than 0.55 pounds also will not require remote ID. So for example, the Mavic Mini falls under this category. So if you're flying a Mavic Mini or something of similar weight, you don't need any remote ID at all. The aircraft registration changed a little bit. So for hobbyists, everything is the same. You only need to get one registration number through the FAA Drone Zone for $5, and you can use that same registration number for all of your aircraft. Now, the new thing is that in the FAA Drone Zone, it will ask you for your remote ID serial number. Now, that serial number will be on the remote ID unit that you buy. If you buy a new drone manufactured after 2022, the remote ID serial number will be printed on the drone itself. If you buy a broadcast module, one of those little postage stamp size things that you put in your old aircraft, that broadcast module will have a serial number associated with that broadcast module. Now, you just take the serial number that's stamped on there and put it in your FAA Drone Zone, and you're good to go. This is how the FAA is going to correlate that serial number or license plate number with who you are. If you're a recreational flyer, you only need one. Use the one broadcast module, and then you can just put it in whichever aircraft you happen to be flying at the time, and that's all you need to do. If you're a commercial user under Part 107, then you need a separate serial number for each aircraft you're flying. You also need a separate registration for each aircraft that you're flying. And again, that can either be the standard remote ID, which is the one that's built into new drones after 2022, or it can be a broadcast module, which you use to retrofit older drones that were manufactured before 2022. Drone manufacturers after June of 2022 will need to be able to, or will have to have standard ID installed on every drone. It is not able to be disabled by the pilot. So in other words, there's no way the pilot can shut it off. and the drone is going to be required to do a self-test of the remote ID system before it's allowed to take off. And if for whatever reason that remote ID radio transmitter isn't working, the computer will not be able to allow the drone to take off. Now, this standard ID that I just talked about here that's going to be built into all new drones does not apply to Homebuilts. So if you're a hobbyist, or not even a hobbyist, if you're just someone who builds drones from scratch in your basement or your garage, you are not going to have to comply with these standard remote ID rules. What you do, if it's a home-built aircraft, is you buy that broadcast module, the $20 postage stamp thing, and you stick it in, and that's all that you have to do. How does the FAA determine what's considered a home-built? Well, all it says is if the aircraft is fabricated at home, it's a home-built. It does not give any percentage requirement like the initial proposal for remote ID said 50% of the aircraft had to be manufactured at home. Well, in the final rule, that 50% thing went away, and there's no threshold for how much of the aircraft has to be manufactured at home. All it says now is if the aircraft is manufactured or assembled or fabricated at home, then it qualifies as this home built, and you don't need standard ID, you just need a broadcast module instead. So the way I read this rule is that model airplane kits that require some home assembly will be eligible for the broadcast module, although I think some of the details on how this is going to be implemented still remain to be seen. And speaking of implementation details, the FAA is still working on that. So for example, we still, as of the recording of this video, don't have a standard for how those radio transmissions are going to be formatted, for what the apps will need to look like to receive those transmissions. And so there are a lot of technical standards that still have to be developed yet. This is a good place to go if you want to get updates. FAA.gov/UAS is a really good place to keep up to date on the status of the implementation of this rule.